Oh, hi. It's Friday. It's now December. Thief came and stole the carrot right out of my hand. It's December 2nd. We're almost out of this year. Only 1/12 to go. More or less. I'm a little out of it today. I had a nasty nightmare last night, but I thought I went back to sleep after I woke up from it. So, but I still woke up pretty early, I guess. Hi, Sharkies. How are ya? Happy Friday. Happy December. Happy puppy. Carrot? Carrot? Eating dinner? What you having? We had a whole lot of homemade macaroni and cheese. It was really good. Very cheesy. Little crispy bits on top. Because it got baked. I do love me some macaroni and cheese. Meatloaf and mashed potatoes. That's hearty sounding. Never made a meatloaf. I don't have anything against meatloaf. Like, it's fine, but it's never been something that I've been like, I don't think I've ever requested meatloaf. Not to talk down on the dinner you're currently having. I'm sure it's delicious. It's just, I don't know. I never think about meatloaf, I guess. It's more a method than a recipe. What? What? What does that mean? Probably put these on. Make it a little easier for me to read the chat. Go get it. He had a bath yesterday. More of a shower, but and the day after tomorrow, we'll be flying to Mexico. I was gonna do a plane. I was like, I'll make a plane with my hand, and then I realized that I don't have a hand gesture for plane. I was gonna start off like this, like yeah, and I was like, that's not a plane. Take a measuring cup. crack an egg in it. Every pound of meat you want, whatever is in the cup. Take a measuring cup, crack an egg in it. Then for every 1 pound of meat you want whatever is in the cup to equal 1 cup. Breadcrumbs, barbecue sauce, cut up veggies, etc. Okay, so do you mean like crack an egg in the cup, then fill it up to 1 cup with breadcrumbs, and then crack an egg in the cup and fill it up to 1 cup with barbecue sauce? Or you just want 1 cup of equal portions breadcrumbs, barbecue sauce, cut up veggies? Not too wet, not too dry. Okay. I see. Hmm. Our recipe for macaroni and cheese is very tasty, but very unpredictable. Like we've never had it fail. It's always good, but we never know. Like there's a part where you're stirring the sauce, because it's a cornstarch based sauce, on the stove, and you just got to keep stirring it, and eventually it thickens up. And it always takes way longer to do that than we expect it to, because we don't make it that often. But it's just like stirring, and eventually you're like, has it thickened up yet? I can't tell anymore. My perception of reality is changing. The whole world seems thick. Well, oh, I just dunked my sleeve strings into my drink. So we read partway through chapter 4 or 5 last time. Partway through chapter 4. No, that can't be right. Partway through chapter 5. We read partway through chapter 5. We read all of chapter 4, partway through chapter 5. On a Wednesday. Look at that guy. He's so excited for me to read this book. What a lovely audience you are, Ben. I should reward that with a carrot. Nice healthy snack. Lots of something in there. Hot off the presses, we've received correspondence that says we have a new bingo sheet. There are some repeat squares and some new ones. We have, it seems, abandoned Garion gets kidnapped in favor of someone being kidnapped. So why don't I go down these columns? Under B, we've got Dernick does something oh no, Garion. There, I was reading two squares at once. Garion does something unexpected. Um, the old favorite, unusual descriptive word used. We've got Garion is clueless about Senedra. Uh, Angst. Oh, a return of Silk being very sarcastic, with the very being underlined. This is not just normal conversation for Silk. And under I, we've got Pyro Dernick, which has been coming up very frequently so far. Mandaralin is dangerously overconfident. Have we had Mandaralin be overconfident yet? I think we've only had him be confident. Overconfident implies he can't do what he says he's going to do. Crying, just anybody, tears shed. Belgarath scratches his beard. That's going to get... Maybe we change that back. That I think Belgarath scratching his beard is a new one for this. And Garion eavesdrops. Which should be, I think, for Garion eavesdropping, this should be not Garion overhears something, but Garion, like, knows he shouldn't be listening in and does anyways, or, you know, positions himself to overhear something. Like, there's got to be intent for Garion eavesdropping. Under N, we've got a new challenger. Taiba causes Relg to go pray. Faldor's farm getting mentioned. What is that? Or other nostalgia. I think specifically Faldor's farm. Our free space is barred. Garion's magic is noisy, as in somebody, I guess, talks down about Garion's magic. Is that what we're doing with that one? And then underneath that, two magic squares in a row, Belgarath or Pole is a snob about magic. Someone complains about it. So it's specifically the noisy part of it. Okay. Under G, someone is kidnapped. Garion gets cocky, aka Garion's high horse that's been happening lately. Silk is a D&D rogue. Oh, hey, God. Something that would make us go, hey, that's anytime magic happens. And then finally, under G is head injury. And then our last column of O, Garion must stay in an uncomfortable situation. Polgara chastises Garion about manners. Don't touch me! Erend offers someone the orb, or Barak suggests violence. I think some of these are going to fill up real quick. I think we are going to get multiple spaces tonight. Which reminds me, I need a marker. Do I have one? Yes, I do. Okay, so last time, Belgarath is fully awake again, but not necessarily fully recovered. They made their way to the Eastern Escarpment, decided not to go down the way that they came up because it would take too long, and they didn't have that amount of time. So they made their way, or maybe it was... Yeah, I think that's what it was. No, they did. They made their way, they decided not to go down the trail they had originally chosen and instead made their way down the way they had come up the ravine. They ditched a lot of their belongings ahead of time. A solid card. And started to make their way down. But the Murgo started rolling boulders down, so Belgarath stayed behind to deflect those, and then Garion lingered back to help him, which Belgarath got real irritable about. He's been pretty cranky, it seems like. Maybe a little more so than usual. They got to the base eventually, and Dernick decided to be a pyro and smoked the Murgos out of the canyon, which bought them some time to get to the river and cross it at the ford, but then they basically lost all of that time when their horses collapsed due to overwork and exhaustion and the cold on their legs from crossing the river. So they got their horses up and moving again, but they pretty much, I think, lost all of the time they had gained, and maybe even then some. Yeah. I think that's... Have I forgotten anything important? Belgarath was suggesting that they may need to tamper with the weather, although he does not like doing that. And that's pretty much where we're at. It's not going to help anyone, but in my copy we're on page 50. Yeah. Let's see if I can find the right spot. Belgarath was saying, that's Taiba and Relg bonded over not being accustomed to light. Yeah. Yeah, and we got some more of Taiba's tragic backstory. I'm just going to start from the top of this page, because I think that might actually... Yeah, I think that's actually where we were. On page 49, there was another brief rumble, and the little boy, perched in the saddle of Aunt Pole's horse, laughed. "Errand," he announced. "I wish he'd stop that," Silk said irritably. And that brings us back to where we're at. So I'm just going to get right into it, because I'm kind of tired. I did not sleep very well last night. They glanced from time to time over the crest of the long hill as they walked. Below, in the broad valley of the Aldur River, the Murgos of Tar Urgas were fording in larger and larger groups. It appeared that fully half his army had reached the west bank by now, and the red and black standard of the King of the Murgos stood planted defiantly on Algarian soil.
"If he brings too many more men down the escarpment, it's going to take something pretty significant to dislodge him,"
Barak rumbled, scowling down at the Murgos.
"I know,"
Belgarath replied,
"and that's the one thing I've wanted to avoid. We aren't ready for a war just yet."
The sun, huge and red, ponderously moved up from behind the eastern escarpment, turning the sky around it rosy. In the still-shadowed valley below them, the Murgos continued to splash across the river in the steely morning light. "Methinks he will await the sun before he begins the search for us," Mandaralan observed.
"And that's not very far off,"
Barak agreed, glancing at the slowly moving band of sunlight just touching the hill along which they moved.
"We've probably got half an hour at the most. I think it's getting to the point where we're going to have to gamble on the horses. Maybe if we switch mounts every mile or so, we can get some more distance out of them."
The rumble that came then could not possibly have been thunder. The ground shook with it, and it rolled on and on endlessly from both the north and south. And then, pouring over the crests of the hills surrounding the valley of the Aldor like some vast tide suddenly released by the bursting of a mighty dam, came the clans of the Algars. Down they plunged upon the startled Murgos thickly clustered along the banks of the river, and their great war cry shook the very heavens as they fell like wolves upon the divided army of Tor Ergas. A lone horseman veered out of the great charge of the clans and came pounding up the hillside toward Garion and his friends. As the warrior drew closer, Garion could see his long scalp lock flowing behind him and his drawn saber catching the first rays of the morning sun. It was Hetar. A vast surge of relief swept over Garion. They were safe. You're picturing the end of The Last Unicorn? With the Red Bull. We don't have Hetar on our bingo sheet. He's been absent for a book.
Where have you been?
Barak demanded in a great voice as the hawk-faced Algar rode closer. Watching, Hetar replied calmly as he reined in. We wanted to let the Murgos get out a ways from the escarpment so we could cut them off. My father sent me to see how you all are. How considerate, Silk observed sardonically. Did it ever occur to you to let us know you were out there? Hetar shrugged. We could see that you were all right. He looked critically at their exhausted mounts. You didn't take very good care of them, he said accusingly. We were a bit pressed, Dernick apologized. Did you get the orb? The tall man asked Belgarath, glancing hungrily down toward the river where a vast battle had been joined.
It took a bit, but we got it,
the old sorcerer replied. Good. Hetar turned his horse, and his lean face had a fierce look on it. I'll tell Chohag. Will you excuse me? Then he stopped as if remembering something. Oh, he said to Barak. Congratulations, by the way.
For what?
The big man asked, looking puzzled. The birth of your son.
What?
Barak sounded stunned.
How?
In the usual way, I'd imagine, Hetar replied.
I mean, how did you find out?
Anheg sent word to us.
When was he born?
A couple months ago. Hetar looked nervously down at the battle which was raging on both sides of the river and in the middle of the ford as well. I really have to go, he said. If I don't hurry, there won't be any Murgos left. And he drove his heels into his horse's flanks and plunged down the hill. He hasn't changed a bit, Silk noted. Barak was standing with a somewhat foolish grin on his big, red-bearded face. Congratulations, my lord, Mandaralin said to him, clasping his hand. Barak's grin grew broader. It quickly became obvious that the situation of the encircled Murgos below was hopeless. With his army cut in two by the river, Tor Ergas was unable to mount even an orderly retreat. The forces he had brought across the river were quickly swarmed under by King Chohag's superior numbers, and the few survivors of that short, ugly melee plunged back into the river, protectively drawn up around the red and black banner of the Murgo king. Even in the ford, however, the Algar warriors pressed him. Some distance upriver, Garion could see horsemen plunging into the icy water to be carried down by the current to the shallows of the ford in an effort to cut off escape. Much of the fight in the river was obscured by the sheets of spray kicked up by struggling horses, but the bodies floating downstream testified to the savagery of the clash. Briefly, for no more than a moment, the red and black banner of Tar Ergas was confronted by the burgundy and white horse banner of King Chohag, and then the two were swept apart. That could have been an interesting meeting, Silk noted. Chohag and Tar Ergas have hated each other for years. Once the king of the Murgos regained the east bank, he rallied what forces he could, turned, and fled back across the open grassland toward the escarpment with Algar clansmen hotly pursuing him. For the bulk of his army, however, there was no escape. Since their horses had not yet descended the narrow ravine from the top of the escarpment, they were forced to fight on foot. The Algars swept down upon them in waves, sabers flashing in the morning sun. Faintly, Garion could hear the screams. Sickened, finally, he turned away, unable to watch the slaughter any longer. The little boy, who was standing close beside Aunt Pole with his hand in hers, looked at Garion gravely. "Erend," he said, with a sad conviction. By mid-morning, the battle was over. The last of the Murgos on the far bank of the river had been destroyed, and Tar Ergas had fled with the tattered remnants of his army back up the ravine.
"Good fight,"
Barak observed professionally, looking down at the bodies littering both banks of the river and bobbing limply in the shallows downstream from the ford. "The tactics of thine Algar cousins were masterly," Mandarellen agreed. "Tar Ergas will take some time to recover from this morning's chastisement." "I'd give a great deal to see the look on his face just now," Silk laughed. "He's probably frothing at the mouth." King Chohag, dressed in steel-plated black leather, and with his horse banner streaming triumphantly in the bright morning sun, came galloping up the hill toward them, closely surrounded by the members of his personal guard. "Interesting morning," he said with the typical Algar understatement as he reined in. I don't remember his voice. "Thanks for bringing us so many Murgos." "He's as bad as Hetar," Silk observed to Barak. The king of the Algars grinned openly as he slowly dismounted. His weak legs seemed almost to buckle as he carefully put his weight on them, and he held on to his saddle for support. "How did things go in Rak Kthol?" he asked.
"It wound up being rather noisy,"
Belgarath replied. "Did you find Ktuchik in good health?"
"Moderately. We corrected that, however. The whole affair set off an earthquake. Most of Rak Kthol slid off its mountaintop, I'm afraid."
Chohag grinned again. "What a shame."
"Where's Hetar?"
Barak asked. "Chasing Murgos, I imagine," Chohag replied. "Their rear guard got cut off, and they're out there trying to find some place to hide."
"There aren't very many hiding places on this plain, are there?"
Barak asked. "Almost none at all," the Algar king agreed pleasantly. A dozen or so Algar wagons crested a nearby hill, rolling toward them through the tall brown grass. They were square boxed conveyances, looking not unlike houses on wheels. They had roofs, narrow windows, and steps at the rear leading up to the doorway at the back of each wagon. It looked, Garion thought, almost like a moving city as they approached. "I imagine Hetar's going to be a while," Chohag noted. "Why don't we have a bit of lunch? I'd like to get word to Anheg and Rodar about what's happened here as soon as possible. but I'm sure you will want to pass a few things along as well. We can talk while we eat." Several of the wagons were drawn up close together, and their sides were let down and joined to form a spacious, low-ceilinged dining hall. Braziers provided warmth, and candles illuminated the interior of the quickly assembled hall, supplementing the bright winter sunlight streaming in through the windows. They dined on roasted meat and mellow ale. Garion soon found that he was wearing far too many clothes. It seemed that he had not been warm in months, and the glowing braziers shimmered out a welcome heat. Although he was tired and felt dirty, he felt warm and safe, and soon he found himself nodding over his plate, almost drowsing, as Belgarath recounted the story of their escape to the Algar king. Gradually, however, as the old man spoke, something alerted Garion. There was, it seemed, a trace too much vivacity in his grandfather's voice, and Belgarath's words sometimes seemed almost to tumble over each other. His blue eyes were very bright, but seemed occasionally a bit unfocused. "So, Zedar got away," Chohag was saying. "That's the only thing that mars the whole affair."
"Zedar's no problem,"
Belgarath replied, smiling in a slightly dazed way. His voice seemed strange, uncertain, and King Chohag looked at the old man curiously. "You've had a busy year, Belgarath," he said.
"A good one, though."
The sorcerer smiled again and lifted his ale cup. His hand was trembling violently, and he stared at it in astonishment. "Aunt Pole!" Garion called urgently. "Are you all right, father?"
"Fine, Paul. Perfectly fine."
He smiled vaguely at her, his unfocused eyes blinking owlishly. He rose suddenly to his feet and began to move toward her, but his steps were lurching, almost staggering. And then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he fell to the floor like a poleaxed cow. "Father!" Aunt Pole exclaimed, leaping to his side. I feel like my screen is flickering a lot. Garion, moving almost as fast as his aunt, knelt on the other side of the unconscious old man. "What's wrong with him?" he demanded. But Aunt Pole did not answer. Her hands were at Belgarath's wrist and brow, feeling for his pulse. She peeled back one of his eyelids and stared intently into his blank, unseeing eyes. "Dernick!" she snapped. "Get my herb bag! Quickly!" The smith bolted for the door. King Chohag had half risen, his face deathly pale. "He isn't." "No," she answered tensely. "He's alive, but only barely." "Is something attacking him?" Silk was on his feet, looking around wildly, his hand unconsciously on his dagger. "No, it's nothing like that." Aunt Pole's hands had moved to the old man's chest. "I should have known," she berated herself. "The stubborn, proud old fool! I should have been watching him." "Please, Aunt Pole," Garion begged desperately. "What's wrong with him?" "He never really recovered from his fight with Ktuchik," she replied. "He's been forcing himself, drawing on his will. Then those rocks in the ravine, but he wouldn't quit. Now he's burned up all his vital energy and will. He barely has enough strength left to keep breathing." Garion had lifted his grandfather's head and cradled it in his lap. "Help me, Garion." He knew instinctively what she wanted. He gathered his will and held out his hand to her. She grasped it quickly, and he felt the force surge out of him. Her eyes were very wide as she intently watched the old man's face. "Again!" And once more she pulled in She pulled the quickly gathered will out of him. Clear! Poof. What are we doing? Garion's voice was shrill. Trying to replace some of what he's lost. Maybe. She glanced toward the door. Hurry, Dernick! She shouted. Dernick rushed back into the wagon. Open the bag, she instructed, and give me that black jar, the one that's sealed with lead, and a pair of iron tongs. Should I open the jar, Mistress Pole? The smith asked. No, just break the seal, carefully, and give me a glove, leather if you can find one. Wordlessly, Silk pulled a leather gauntlet from under his belt and handed it to her. She pulled it on, opened the black jar, and reached inside with the tongs. With great care, she removed a single, dark, oily-looking green leaf. She held it very carefully in the tongs. Pry his mouth open, Garion, she ordered. Garion wedged his fingers between Belgarath's clenched teeth and carefully pried the old man's jaws apart. Aunt Pole pulled down her father's lower lip, reached inside his mouth with the shiny leaf, and lightly brushed his tongue with it, once and once only. Belgarath jumped violently, and his feet suddenly scraped on the floor. His muscles heaved, and his arms began to flail about. Hold him down, Aunt Pole commanded. She pulled back sharply and held the leaf out of the way while Mandaralin and Barak jumped in to hold down Belgarath's convulsing body. Give me a bowl, she ordered, a wooden one. Dernick handed her one, and she deposited the leaf and the tongs in it. Then, with great care, she took off the gauntlet and laid it atop the leaf. Take this, she told the smith. Don't touch any part of the glove. What do you want me to do with it, Mistress Pole? Take it out and burn it, bowl and all, and don't let anyone get into the smoke from it. Is it that dangerous? Silk asked. It's even worse, but those are the only precautions we can take out here. Dernick swallowed very hard and left the wagon. Holding the bowl as if it were a live snake. Polgara took a small mortar and pestle and began grinding certain herbs from her bag into a fine powder as she watched Belgarath intently. How far is it to the stronghold, Chohag? She asked the Algar king. A man on a good horse could make it in half a day, he replied. How long by wagon? A wagon driven carefully to avoid bouncing? 2 days. She frowned, still mixing the herbs in the mortar. All right. There's no help for it, I guess. Please send Hetar to Queen Sylar. Sylar? I think we decided on Sylar, maybe. Have him tell her that I'm going to need a warm, well-lighted chamber with a good bed and no drafts. Dernick, I want you to drive the wagon. Don't hit any bumps, even if it means losing an hour. The smith nodded.
He's going to be all right, isn't he?
Barak asked, his voice strained and his face shocked by Belgarath's sudden collapse. It's really too early to say, she replied. He's been on the point of collapse for days, maybe, but he wouldn't let himself go. I think he's past this crisis, but there may be others. She laid one hand on her father's chest. Put him in bed, carefully. Then I want a screen of some kind around the bed. Blankets will do. We have to keep him very quiet and out of drafts. No loud noises. They all stared at her as the significance of her extreme precautions struck them. Move, gentlemen, she told them firmly. His life may depend on a certain speed. That's the end of chapter 5, which we were already partway through. Well, she held tongs while wearing a leather gauntlet to pick up the leaf, and then she said, "Don't touch any part of the leather" on the gauntlets that didn't even touch the leaf. So, whatever it is, I guess it's pretty dangerous, yeah. And yet she touched Belgarath's tongue with it. So, okay. Chapter 6. The wagon seemed barely to crawl. The high, thin cloud had swept in again to hide the sun. Excuse me. It's sort of odd. The high, thin cloud. Not the high, thin clouds, which could work, or a high, thin cloud, but the high, thin cloud, which kind of implies it's one specific cloud that came back. I hope I don't have the hiccups all of a sudden. We had Dernick told to go burn something, but that wasn't his idea, so I don't think that counts. We had a crisis, which I don't think counts as angst. There was one other thing that I was kind of wondering about. There was a moment of Silk being sarcastic. No one said anything, so I'm guessing it didn't qualify for being very sarcastic. And we did have Belgarath fall over like a poleaxed cow. But I don't know if that description is necessarily out of place, which is what we were kind of thinking previously. It is a bit unusual, but it meant what it said, I guess, right? Like, yeah, we had a brief bit of sarcasm from Silk. Yeah, I don't know that it was enough though. It wasn't unusual levels. Yeah. I was a little surprised that Aaron didn't offer anyone the orb, and I was a little surprised when Garion was feeling all warm and safe that he didn't think of Faldor's farm at all. Looking for a word, not phrase. What? Oh, the poleaxed cow thing? I suppose. I'm sure in the battle there were head injuries, but none of them happened to our heroes, and none of them were particularly called out. So I don't think we actually got any squares. Alright, so the high thin cloud had swept in again to hide the sun, and a kind of leaden chill descended on the featureless plain of southern Algaria. Garion rode inside the wagon, thick-headed and numb with exhaustion, watching with dreadful concern as Aunt Pole hovered over the unconscious Belgarath. Oh, I've got 2 left bin. Sleep was out of the question. Another crisis could arise at any time, and he had to be ready to leap to her aid, joining his will and the power of his amulet with hers. Errand, his small face grave, sat quietly in a chair at the far side of the wagon. his hands firmly clasped around the pouch Dernick had made for him. The sound of the orb still hung in Garion's ears, muted but continual. He had grown almost accustomed to the song in the weeks since they had left Rakthol, but at quiet moments, or when he was tired, it always seemed to return with renewed strength. It was somehow a comforting sound. Aunt Pole leaned forward to touch Belgarath's chest. "What's wrong?" Garion asked in a sharp whisper. "Nothing's wrong, Garion," she replied calmly. "Please don't keep saying that every time I so much as move. If something's wrong, I'll tell you." "I'm sorry. I'm just worried, that's all." She turned to give him a steady look. "Why don't you take Erend and go up and ride on top of the wagon with Silk and Dernick? What if you need me? I'll call you, dear." "I'd really rather stay, Aunt Pole." "I'd really rather you didn't. I'll call if I need you." "But now, Garion." Garion knew better than to argue. He took Erend out the back door of the wagon and up the steps to the top. "How is he?" Silk asked. "How should I know? All I know is that she chased me out." Garion's reply was a bit surly. "That might be a good sign, you know." "Maybe." Garion looked around. Off to the west there was a range of low hills. Rearing above them stood a vast pile of rock. "The Algar Stronghold," Dernick told Garion, pointing. "Are we that close? That's still a good day's ride." "How high is it?" Garion asked. 400 or 500 feet at least," Silk told him. "The Algars have been building at it for several thousand years. It gives them something to do after the calving season." Angst. He was surly. Was that angsty enough to be angst? I think we can hold out for angstier angst. For some real angsty angst. Hi. Is it because I was moving my foot down here? He knows there's one piece of carrot left and he wants it. Well, he was described as surly there, wasn't he? Garion's reply was a bit surly. But yes, he is also, of course, legitimately worried. Barak rode up.
"How's Belgarath?"
he asked as he approached. "I think he might be improving, just a little," Garion answered. "I don't know for sure, though." Yeah.
"That's something, anyway."
The big man pointed toward a gully just ahead.
"You'd better go around that,"
he told Dernick.
"King Johag says that the ground gets a bit rough through there."
Dernick nodded and changed the wagon's direction. Throughout the day, the stronghold of the Algars loomed higher and higher against the western horizon. It was a vast, towering fortress rearing out of the dun-colored hills. "A monument to an idea that got out of hand," Silk observed as he lounged idly atop the wagon. "I don't quite follow that," Dernick said. "Algars are nomads," the little man explained. "They live in wagons like this one and follow their herds. The stronghold gives Murgo raiders something to attack. That's its only real purpose. Very practical, really. It's much easier than looking for them all over these plains. The Murgos always come here, and it's a convenient place to wipe them out." "Don't the Murgos realize that?" Dernick looked a bit skeptical. "Quite possibly, but they come here anyway because they can't resist the place. They simply can't accept the fact that nobody really lives here. Silk grinned his ferret-like little grin. You know how stubborn Murgos are. Anyway, over the years, the Algar clans have developed a sort of competition. Every year they try to outdo one another in hauling rock, and the stronghold keeps growing higher and higher. But can Murgos resist the taste of the stronghold? Did Kaltorak really lay siege to it for 8 years? Garion asked him. Garion, we've been over this. You don't call him Kaltorak. Silk nodded. They say his army was like a sea of Angarax dashing itself to pieces against the walls of the stronghold. They might still be here, but they ran out of food. That's always been the problem with large armies. Any fool can raise an army, but you start running into trouble around supper time. As they approached the man-made mountain, the gates opened and a party emerged to greet them. In the lead, on a white palfrey, rode Queen Silar, with Hetar close behind. At a certain point, they stopped and sat waiting. Garion lifted a small trapdoor in the roof of the wagon. We're here, Aunt Pole, he reported in a hushed voice. Good, she replied. How is grandfather? He's sleeping. His breathing seems a bit stronger. Go ask Chohag to take us inside immediately. I want to get father into a warm bed as soon as possible. Yes, Aunt Pole. Garion lowered the trapdoor and then went down the steps at the rear of the slowly moving wagon. He untied his horse, mounted, and rode to the front of the column where the Algar Queen was quietly greeting her husband. Excuse me, he said respectfully, swinging down from his horse, but Aunt Pole wants to get Belgarath inside at once. How is he? Hetar asked. Aunt Pole says that his breathing's getting stronger, but she's still worried. From the rear of the group that had emerged from the stronghold, there was a flurry of small hooves. The colt that had been born in the hills above Maragor burst into view and came charging directly at them. Garion immediately found himself swarmed under by the colt's exuberant greetings. The small horse nuzzled him and butted at him with his head, then pranced away, only to gallop back again. It's like Bennebic when we come home from being out. When Garion put his hand on the animal's neck to calm him, the colt quivered with joy at his touch. He's been waiting for you, Hetar said to Garion. He seems to have known you were coming. The wagon drew up and stopped. The door opened, and Aunt Pole looked out. Everything's ready, Polgara, Queen Silar told her. Thank you, Silar. Is he recovering at all? He seems better, but it's very hard to say for sure at this point. I don't know if it's just because I kind of thought about it early on in this book, but I feel like he's using the word, the author, David Eddings, is using the word very a lot. A lot of very hushed, very quietly, very etc. I think more so than usual. Now you'll all notice too. Erend, who had been watching from the top of the wagon, suddenly clambered down the steps at the rear, hopped to the ground, and ran out along the legs of the horses. Catch him, Garion, Aunt Pole said. I think he'd better ride in here with me until we get inside the stronghold. As Garion started after the little boy, the colt scampered away, and Erend, laughing with delight, ran after him. Erend! Garion called sharply. The colt, however, had turned in mid-gallop and suddenly bore down on the child, his hooves flailing wildly. Erend, showing no signs of alarm, stood smiling directly in its path. Startled, the little horse stiffened his legs and skidded to a stop. Erend laughed and held out his hand. The colt's eyes were wide as he sniffed curiously at the hand, and then the boy touched the small animal's face. Again, within the vaults of his mind, Garion seemed to hear that strange, bell-like note, and the dry voice murmured, "Done," with a peculiar sort of satisfaction. "What's that supposed to mean?" Garion asked silently, but there was no answer. He shrugged and picked Erend up to avoid any chance collision between horse and child. The colt stood staring at the two of them, its eyes wide as if in amazement. When Garion turned to carry Erend back to the wagon, it trotted alongside, sniffing and even nuzzling at the child. Garion wordlessly handed Erend up to Aunt Pole and looked her full in the face. She said nothing as she took the child, but her expression told him plainly that something very important had just happened. As he turned to remount his horse, he felt that someone was watching him, and he turned quickly toward the group of riders that had accompanied Queen Scylla from the stronghold. Just behind the queen was a tall girl mounted on a roan horse. She had long, dark brown hair, and the eyes she had fixed on Garion were gray, calm, and very serious. Her horse pranced nervously, and she calmed him with a quiet word and a gentle touch, then turned to gaze openly at Garion again. He had the peculiar feeling that he ought to know her. The wagon creaked as Dernick shook the reins to start the team, and they all followed King Chohag and Queen Scylla through a narrow gate into the stronghold. Anyone have any guesses about what just happened there? Garion saw immediately that there were no buildings inside the towering fortress. Instead, there was a maze of stone walls, perhaps 20 feet high, twisting this way and that without any apparent plan. "But where is thy city, your majesty?" Mandarellen asked in perplexity. "Inside the walls themselves," King Chohag replied. "They're thick enough and high enough to give us all the room we could possibly need." "What purpose hath all this, then?" "It's just a trap," the king shrugged. "We permit attackers to break through the gates, and then we deal with them in here. We want to go this way." He led them along a narrow alleyway. They dismounted in a courtyard beside the vast wall. Barak and Hatar unhooked the latches and swung the side of the wagon down. Barak tugged thoughtfully at his beard as he looked at the sleeping Belgarath.
"It would probably disturb him less if we just took him inside, bed and all," he suggested.
"Right," Hatar agreed, and the two of them climbed up into the wagon to lift out the sorcerer's bed. Trap singular. This place is nothing but trap. "Just don't bounce him around," Polgara cautioned, "and don't drop him."
"We've got him, Polgara," Barak assured her. "I know you might not believe it, but we're almost as concerned about him as you are."
With the two big men carrying the bed, they passed through an arched doorway into a wide, torch-lighted corridor and up a flight of stairs, then along another hallway to another flight. "Pivot!"
"Is it much farther?"
Barak asked. Sweat was running down his face into his beard.
"This bed isn't getting any lighter, you know."
Just up here, the Algar Queen told him.
I hope he appreciates all this when he wakes up,
Barak grumbled. The room to which they carried Belgarath was large and airy. A glowing brazier stood in each corner, and a broad window overlooked the maze inside the walls of the stronghold. Oh, a nice view of the slaughter room. A canopied bed stood against one wall, and a large wooden tub against the other. This will be just fine, Polgara said approvingly. Thank you, Silar. We love him too, Polgara, Queen Silar replied quietly. Polgara drew the drapes, darkening the room. Then she turned back to the corners. Then she turned back the covers, and Belgarath was transferred to the canopied bed so smoothly that he did not even stir. He looks a little better, Silk said. He needs sleep, rest, and quiet more than anything right now, Polgara told him, her eyes intent on the old man's sleeping face. We'll leave you with him, Polgara, Queen Silar said. She turned to the rest of them. Why don't we all go down to the main hall? Supper's nearly ready, but in the meantime I'll have some ale brought in. He said that they had a city inside the walls. So they've got like accommodations for when they need to stay there and kill Murgos. And since they've got accommodations, they've got to have some nice accommodations for, I don't know, maybe it's the Queen's bed. Maybe they had it built in the past 2 days when Hetar showed up to tell them they needed it. In the meantime, I'll have some ale brought in. Barak's eyes brightened noticeably, and he started toward the door. Barak, Polgara called to him. So it's a murder hotel. Yeah, exactly. Aren't you and Hetar forgetting something? She looked pointedly at the bed they had used for a stretcher. Barak sighed. He and Hetar picked up the bed again. Yeah, that could be it. I'll send some supper up for you, Polgara, the Queen said. Thank you, Selar. Aunt Pole turned to Garion, her eyes grave. The word grave has been used at least 3 times now, but no grim yet. Stay for a few moments, dear, she asked, and he remained as the others all quietly left. Close the door, Garion, she said, pulling a chair up beside the sleeping old man's bed. He shut the door and crossed the room back to her. Is he really getting better, Aunt Pole? She nodded. I think we're past the immediate danger. He seems stronger, physically, but it's not his physical body I'm worried about. It's his mind. That's why I wanted to talk to you alone. Garion felt a sudden cold grip of fear. His mind? Keep your voice down, dear, she told him quietly. This has to be kept strictly between us. Her eyes were still on Belgarath's face. An episode like this can have very serious effects. Very serious. And there's no way to know how he'll be when he recovers. He could be very seriously weakened. It's not just me, right? Weakened? How? His will could be greatly reduced, to that of any other old man. He drained it to the utter limit, and he might have gone so far that he'll never regain his powers. You mean He wouldn't be a sorcerer anymore? Don't repeat the obvious, Garion, she said wearily. If that happens, it's going to be up to you and me to conceal it from everybody. Your grandfather's power is the one thing that has held the Angarax in check for all these years. If something has happened to that power, then you and I will have to make it look as if he's the same as he always was. We'll have to conceal the truth even from him, if that's possible. What can we do without him? We'd go on, Garion, she replied quietly, looking directly into his eyes. Our task is too important for us to falter because a man falls by the wayside, even if that man happens to be your grandfather. We're racing against time in all this. We absolutely must fulfill the prophecy and get the orb back to Riva by Aristide, and there are people who must be gathered up to go with us. Who? Princess Sinedra, for one. Sinedra? Garion had never really forgotten the little princess, but he failed to see why Aunt Pole was making such an issue of her going with them to Riva. In time you'll understand, dear. All of this is part of a series of events that must occur in proper sequence and at the proper time. In most situations, the present is determined by the past. This series of events is different, however. In this case, what's happening in the present is determined by the future. If we don't get it exactly the way it's supposed to be, the ending will be different, and I don't think any of us would like that at all. What do you want me to do? He asked, placing himself unquestioningly in her hands. She smiled gratefully at him. Thank you, Garion, she said simply. When you rejoin the others, they're going to ask you how Father's coming along, and I want you to put on your best face and tell them that he's doing fine. You want me to lie to them? It was not even a question. No place in the world is safe from spies, Garion. You know that as well as I. Well, yeah, he definitely does. And no matter what happens, we can't let any hint that Father might not recover fully get back to the Angarax. If necessary, you'll lie until your tongue turns black. The whole fate of the West could depend on how well you do it. He stared at her. It's possible that all this is totally unnecessary, she reassured him. He may be exactly the same as always after he's had a week or two of rest, but we've got to be ready to move smoothly, just in case he's not. Can't we do something? We're doing all we can. Go back to the others now, Garion, and smile. Smile until your jaw aches if you have to. There was a faint sound in the corner of the room, and they both turned sharply. Errand, his blue eyes very serious, stood watching them. Never safe from spies. Take him with you, Aunt Pole said. See that he eats and keep an eye on him. Garion nodded and beckoned to the child. Errand smiled his trusting smile and crossed the room. He reached out and patted the unconscious Belgarath's hand, then turned to follow Garion from the room. The tall, brown-haired girl who had accompanied Queen Sillar out through the gates of the stronghold was waiting for him in the corridor outside. Her skin, Garion noticed, was very pale, almost translucent, and her gray eyes were direct. Is the eternal man really any better? She asked. Much better, Garion replied, with all the confidence he could muster. He'll be out of bed in no time at all. He seems so weak, she said. So old and frail. Frail? Belgarath? Garion forced a laugh. He's made out of old iron and horseshoe nails. He is 7,000 years old, after all. That doesn't mean anything to him. He stopped paying attention to the years a long time ago. You're Garion, aren't you? She asked. Queen Scylla told us about you when she returned from Val Alorn last year. For some reason, I thought you were younger. I was, then, Garion replied. I've aged a bit this last year. I thought you were younger a year ago. I was younger a year ago. Yep, all right. That holds up. So, any bets on what's going on with her yet? My name is Adara, the tall girl introduced herself. Queen Scylla asked me to show you the way to the main hall. Supper should be ready soon. Garion inclined his head politely. In spite of the worry gnawing at him, he could not shake off the peculiar feeling that he ought to know this quiet, beautiful girl. Erend reached out and took the girl's hand, and the three of them passed hand in hand down the torchlit corridor. King Chohag's main hall was on a lower floor. It was a long, narrow room where chairs and padded benches sat in little clusters around braziers filled with glowing coals. Barak, holding a large ale tankard in one huge fist, was describing, with some embellishment, their descent from the top of the escarpment.
We didn't really have any choice, you see,
the big man was saying.
Tar Ergas had been frothing on our heels for several days, and we had to take the shortest way down.
Hatar nodded. Plans sometimes have a way of changing when the unexpected crops up, he agreed. That's why we put men to watching every known pass down from the top of the escarpment.
I still think you might have let us know you were there.
Barak sounded a little injured. Hatar grinned wolfishly. We couldn't really take the chance, Barak, he explained. The Murgos might have seen us. Yeah. And we didn't want to frighten them off. It would have been a shame if they'd gotten away, wouldn't it?
Is that all you ever think about?
Hatar considered the question for a moment. Pretty much, yes, he admitted. Supper was announced then, and they all moved to the long table at the far end of the hall. The general conversation at the table made it unnecessary for Garion to lie directly to anyone about the frightening possibility Aunt Pole had raised, and after supper he sat beside Adara and lapsed into a kind of sleepy haze, only half listening to the talk. There was a stir at the door, and a guard entered. The priest of Belar, he announced in a loud voice. And a tall man in a white robe strode into the room, followed by 4 men dressed in shaggy furs. The 4 walked with a peculiar shuffling gait, and Garion instantly recognized them as bear cultists, indistinguishable from the Cherek members of the same group he had seen in Val Alorn. Oi, these guys.
Your Majesty,
The man in the white robe boomed.
Hail Chohag,
The cultists intoned in unison.
Chief of the clan chiefs of the Algars, and guardian of the southern reaches of Eloria.
King Chohag inclined his head briefly. What is it, Elvar? He asked the priest.
I have come to congratulate your Majesty upon the occasion of your great victory over the forces of the Dark God,
the priest replied. You are most kind, Elvar, Chohag answered politely.
Moreover,
Elvar continued,
it has come to my attention that a holy object has come into the stronghold of the Algars. I presume that your Majesty will wish to place it in the hands of the priesthood for safekeeping.
Garion, alarmed at the priest's suggestion, half rose from his seat, but stopped, not knowing how to voice his objection. Erend, however, with a confident smile, was already walking toward Elvar. The knots Dernick had so carefully tied were undone, and the child took the orb out of the pouch at his waist and offered it to the startled priest. Erend, he said. Elvar's eyes bulged, and he recoiled from the orb, lifting his hands above his head to avoid touching it. No, it's not bingo. It's a space. I'll get to it. You don't say bingo till you get a line. Both of you. Go ahead, Elvar. Polgara's voice came mockingly from the doorway. Let him who is without ill intent in the silence of his soul stretch forth his hand and take the orb.
Lady Polgara,
the priest stammered.
We thought, that is,
He seems to have some reservations, Silk suggested dryly. Perhaps he has some lingering and deep-seated doubts about his own purity. That's a serious failing in a priest, I'd say. Elvar looked at the little man helplessly, his hands still held aloft. You should never ask for something you're not prepared to accept, Elvar, Polgara suggested.
Lady Polgara,
Elvar blurted.
We thought that you'd be so busy caring for your father that...
He faltered. That you could take possession... He did a little wink there. That you could take possession of the orb before I knew about it? Think again, Elvar. I won't allow the orb to fall into the hands of the bear cult. She smiled rather sweetly at him. Unless you happen to be the one destined to wield it, of course. My father and I would both be overjoyed to hand the burden over to someone else. Why don't we find out? All you have to do is reach out your hand and take the orb. Elvar's face blanched, and he backed away from Erend fearfully. I believe that will be all, Elvar, King Chohag said firmly. The priest looked about helplessly, then turned and quickly left the hall with his cultists close behind him. Make him put it away, Dernick, Polgara told the smith, and see if you can do something about the knots. I could seal them up with lead, Dernick mused. Maybe that would keep him from getting it open. It might be worth a try. Then she looked around. I thought you might all like to know that my father's awake, she told them. The old fool appears to be stronger than we thought. Garion, immediately alert, looked at her sharply, trying to detect some hint that she might not be telling them everything. But her calm face was totally unreadable. Yeah, right? I love that whole scene. Hey, we hear the orb got brought in here. We want it. Okay, here. Here you go. Ah! No! Take it away! Make him stop! It's literally doing what you asked, like. Yeah, I love that scene. It's just so like, he didn't think this through. He's like a dog chasing a car. He wouldn't know what to do if he caught it. Oh, Alvar. All right. Let's see. Barak, laughing loudly with relief, slapped Hetar on the back.
I told you he'd be all right,
he exclaimed delightedly. The others in the room were already crowding around Polgara, asking for details. He's awake, she told them. That's about all I can say at the moment, except that he's his usual charming self. He's already complaining about lumps in the bed and demanding strong ale. I'll send some at once, Queen Silar said. No, Silar, Polgara replied firmly. He gets broth, not ale. He won't like that much, Silk suggested. Isn't that a shame? She smiled. She turned, as if about to go back to the sick room, then stopped and looked rather quizzically at Garion, who sat, relieved, but still apprehensive about Belgarath's true condition, beside Adara. I see that you've met your cousin, she observed. Who? Don't sit there with your mouth open, Garion, she advised him. It makes you look like an idiot. Adara is the youngest daughter of your mother's sister. Haven't I ever told you about her? It all came crashing in on him. Aunt Pole, he protested. How could you forget something that important? But Adara, obviously as startled by the announcement as he had been, gave a low cry, put her arms about his neck, and kissed him warmly. Dear cousin, she exclaimed. Garion flushed, then went pale, then flushed again. He stared first at Aunt Pole, then at his cousin, unable to speak or even think coherently. And that's the end of chapter 6. Oh. So in case anyone was worried that there was going to be like a weird love triangle or something, you can put your fears to rest. Garion's got another family member. Don't do that to a 16-year-old boy. I mean, she could have told him years ago. Remember when he was having that whole, like, existential crisis about not having any family? Although if he had known then, he might have gone running off to Algaria on his own. Yeah. There were some funny parts there. Is that all you ever think about? Yeah. And the Colt is back. Oh, right. And I need to Mark that space. Right here, and offer someone the orb. Hatar is back. We've got royalty for Garion to be awkward in front of again. It feels like his brief interactions there were pretty straightforward, but also he was dealing with, bigger problems. But it's possible that he's been around enough royalty at this point that he's starting to get the hang of it. He might have one rank in court etiquette by now. Are you eagerly awaiting for me to be done, or are you eagerly awaiting that last piece of carrot? He keeps kind of looking at me and then looking over this way. Like he just moves his eyes. So he's waiting for the carrot. Oh. Well. It could be both. Yeah, I guess so. Is there a difference? Difference between waiting for me and waiting for carrot? Yeah, there's definitely a difference. He has a different eagerness when waiting for food. Carrot could come sooner. Yeah. All right, Ben. Last piece. Last piece. Oh, you have a big piece of fluff sticking off your side. Right. Oh boy. I just reached down and poof. This is how he sheds. You can just reach down and pull big tufts of fur out of his coat. I just wasn't expecting that much to come out. I reached for a much smaller piece. He needs brush. He probably also needs to take a wander. Oh, okay. One piece. Which hand's it going to be in? Which hand? Which hand? That one? Sniff, sniff. Oh, he's pretty insistent. Oh, he's pawing at this one, which is correct. You did it. He, glanced at my other hand, but then he was like, nope, it's that one. Yeah, we're not doing that. Alright. Well, this was fun. And now I'm going to take a week off. So, just to reiterate, there'll be no stream on next Wednesday or Friday, the 7th or 9th. But I should, barring any, anything unexpected, be back for the 14th. So I hope everyone has a lovely week off, but come back on the 14th ready for more reading. Try not to miss me too much. Nice and toasted. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's going to be... with this snow that's been happening, it's a good time to get out of here for a little bit. Hopefully it's not too miserable here while we're gone, but yeah. So have a lovely evening and a lovely weekend and a lovely full week and then another weekend and then another half a week and then I'll see you again. All right. Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.